Okay, I think we're recording. All right. So, okay, so now that we have the basic Zoom instructions shared, may I welcome you again to this webinar called How Do I Know I've Been Colonized? And Let Us Count the Ways. So my name is Heidi Divya-Bertu, and I represent the Virginia Community Rights Network to the board of the National Community Rights Network. So we have a program tonight that we hope will inspire and move us all along the path of discovery of who we are as individuals and as ardent community activists, daring to make our world a better home for all. We have a 30-minute presentation, first by Susie, then Tom, and followed by a discussion. Susie Beiersdorfer will speak first. She is the president of the National Community Rights Network and the secretary for the Ohio Community Rights Network. She's a teacher, geologist, community activist, and tree planter extraordinaire who has lived in Youngstown for 28 years. So Susie co-founded Frack-Free Mahoning Valley and the Youngstown Community Bill of Rights Committee, which organized events to educate the public on the dangers of fracking and the injustice of government-corporate collusion. These groups got 10 citizen initiative campaigns on the ballot over 6 years between 2013 and 2018. These campaigns included proposed local laws, such as to ban fracking, to protect drinking water, to assert the right to a livable climate, and to stop outside corporate money from influencing local elections. And next then we'll have Dr. Tom Groover. He's currently a director of the Colorado Community Rights Network and sits on the board of the National Community Rights Network. He was a director of East Boulder County United and the Boulder County Community Rights Network. In 2014, Tom planned and helped launch a Boulder County initiative for adopting a home rule charter, which featured a community bill of rights for banning fracking. 1,800 new fracking wells were planned for the Boulder County neighborhoods, and the political pressure exerted by this action contributed to further extension of the fracking moratorium and the state's adoption of a 2,000-foot fracking well setback. Dr. Groover is director of the Boulder Chiropractic Clinic and lives with his wife in Superior, Colorado. And drum roll, Susie, please take it away.
I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so good evening, and we will be looking over this PowerPoint based on Jane Ann Morris's 1998 article, Help, I've Been Colonized and I Can't Get Up. And we're going to start with a poll. And this is all new to us, but we're excited to try new things. So can everyone see the poll? Go ahead and vote.
We can't see the poll.
Can't see the poll. Okay. Let me try. We practiced before. How's that? There.
Yep.
Good. All right, so as you can see, everyone agrees that we can honestly say, or can say that the Earth is not better off today than it was 50 years ago. So 50 years ago was the Earth Day, and that's when there was citizen uprising, which led to amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948, which with such things as the Clean Water Act of 1972. I Googled that and it said when major citizen actions led to the creation of these amendments. Now, of course, what I just repeated, the cause, citizen concern, and the effect, stricter regulations, is colonized thinking. And sorry, I had not shared the results, so it was 100%. So this is colonized thinking. This is believing that our government is charged with protecting the well-being of people and the environment. But I know we could all tell stories about the first time we realized that the government was not protecting us, that the EPA was not protecting us, and or evidence that profit over planet was the driving force for the government corporate collusion. So as the article states, none of this discussion is meant to belittle any of the efforts that we have done, because we have only acted in the way we thought we were supposed to act. Sounds like being colonized. So we will begin this slideshow. And in this slideshow, we will talk about decolonizing our minds, rewriting the defining laws of corporations, abolishing corporate constitutional rights, legalizing sustainability, and also the assertion of self-government and community rights. Let's see if I can. There we go. Okay, so civil disobedience runs the spectrum from carrying signs and chanting at rallies or protesting outside government officials' offices, to disrupting official meetings, blockades, lockdowns, and other actions. There is often a police presence, but as long as we remain respectful, they just kind of hang out and tolerate us until we leave. Also, many of us have used and continue to use community bills of rights as civil disobedience, because we have learned that there's no real access to the government that is supposed to be of, by, and for the people. It is stated in many constitutions and the federal constitution that all political power is inherent in the people. And if the government is not serving us, we have the right to alter, amend, or abolish that government. So slide 3 is the regulatory system participation. We have all spent many hours doing these colonized actions. And for a very timely example, just this morning, an LTE was published in the Columbus, Ohio Dispatch by a friend and fellow activist that denounces officials, state agencies, and Jobs Ohio for continuing to promote an ethane cracker plant along the Ohio River. And that just makes plastic nurgles for single plastic products. So our friend writes, for years, environmental organizations, public health advocates, and local citizens have opposed this massively polluting cracker plant, testifying against it in permit hearings and writing letters and signing petitions. This is what colonized minds look and act like, and we are all colonized. Second poll. Get to the second one. Yes. So has my organizing followed the gambling addiction model as outlined in Jane Ann Morris's article? So take a few moments and check off all that apply.
Susie, it doesn't appear that we can check it off.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, How many of us have worked harder on testimony, spent hours? Oh, somebody was, oh, you know what? You're a host or a co-host, Heidi. So somebody did do one, but anyway, I'll just read them then. Try harder to repeat our failed tactics. The gambling addiction model, the last bet didn't pay off, but the next one might. And I know we've always thought, I mean, many of us have thought if we only had more people, more experts, more money, more time, you know, we could, you know, make change, make systemic change, you know, getting more people, including celebrities, and then fundraising, because if we had more money, we'd have more success. And not sure why that doesn't work, but all right. So organizing according to the corporate script. I'm sure many people have, or a lot of you have read this article. If not, we will have it in the chat so that you can copy it. But some of the, you know, the things that we do according to the corporate script are our campaigns focus on single issues while others go undefended. So that's, you know, one chemical, one industry, one species. You know, we describe the problem over and over to each other and, you know, preaching to the choir, we've heard that. We splitting of resources and dissipation of power. That's interesting. That just, I don't know if the poll came up, but we'll stop sharing that. You know, they want to divide us. We fracture. They want to divide us along issues, along strategies, and along access. And that's certainly happening with Ohio now. There's 2 bills in our legislature to make radioactive brine waste, toxic brine waste, a commodity. And the Ohio Community Rights Network came up with a campaign to give packets of information to the county prosecutors and the attorney general to open an investigation. And we're finding that really our government doesn't even know how to work to protect the people, even though there are laws on the books saying that if an entity poisons the water, they can be subject to a criminal investigation and criminal indictment. So it's very interesting what's happening there. I've got 2 screens going, so. Okay. So also, you know, we argue a lot about, you know, if we could only be more organized. You know, I know for myself, I hadn't really thought much about our own brains, you know, and our own actions being colonized, being, you know, following the corporate script, following the fixed system, thinking that we do what we need to do. That's also, we've called that the hamster wheel. So, you know, we know people whose minds are colonized, but we don't look in the mirror often enough to recognize it in ourselves. The Black Lives Matter movement and indigenous organizing like Standing Rock have affirmed for many of us that not only are Black, Indigenous, and people of color being oppressed, but we, the privileged descendants of settlers, have been deluded into thinking that the government is working for us. Now, the BIPOC folks have known this. Again, you know, they want to see us fractured and divided. Also, many environmental organizations fight to outdo, dismiss, demonize other environmental organizations' missions and campaigns. Again, the power over approach that our fixed system, you know, works so well. It's often hard to find common ground and work with shared power for a common goal. I think we can all think of a big environmental group that we, you know, would denounce. And hard to work together. So this does not mean that we compromise our missions to try to get along. That'll just keep us stuck in the hamster wheel, the Ferris wheel, what Jane Ann Morris says, at the democracy theme park, where there's a lot of levers working, but they're not connected to anything. So we also censor ourselves. We're told to be respectful, to control our emotions. How many people have heard officials say, I appreciate your passion, but. So the laws are created to serve the corporate agenda, where property is hoarded or destroyed for profit. People in nature are ignored or exploited or harmed. From the article, the article says, why can't we get our views accurately presented on TV or in print or other meeting? I'm going to admit someone. Why can't we get our views accurately presented on TV, print, or other media? It's because it's corporate private property law and FCC regulations. And why can't we imprison corporate criminals? That's liability law. So remember when it was, and sometimes it is, a status of honor for an organization to have a seat at the table for crumbs. So organizing, again, continuing about organizing according to the corporate script. Corporations are persons. Again, we get into this hamster wheel, just trying to get things done, but then finding that everything we're doing is not working. So colonized minds and actions perpetuate further degradation of the environment and of a moral society. So from the article, she says, we work around the defining laws that are the groundwork for a rigged system. We're looking for favors, for lucky breaks. We don't even dream of control, yet we call this democracy. The corporate strategy, they don't fight against themselves. They don't dilute their resources. Every time a corporate gets a win, it's a win for all of them. And then, the way that laws have been written, they have basically personhood, and in many cases, more rights than we the people. So the corporate strategy, write regulatory laws. Corporations often write the laws that will regulate their product or process without safety of people or environment even considered. Heidi will put a link to an article about ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. Basically, corporations write the bills that regulate themselves and exchange campaign finances to the legislators who sponsored the bills to become law. Again, from the article, at regulatory agencies, corporate persons have constitutional rights to due process and equal protection that human persons do not have. For non-corporate human citizens, there's a democracy theme park where we can pull levers on voting machines and talk into microphones at hearings. But don't worry, they're not connected to anything, and nobody's listening except us. So environmental agencies have been said to regulate environmentalists, not the corporations, not the industry, who oftentimes write the laws that the agencies enforce. And why regulatory agencies fail? Well, they're set up with cooperation from big corporations. they're sometimes at the urging of big corporations, and they're the defining law of corporations. And you'll learn more about that in Tom's part of the presentation. So now we're going to watch a clip from a C-SPAN video from 1996, Jane Ann Morris presenting a history of corporate power. So I'm going to need to unshare and reshare my screen.
So while we're watching this video, to make sure that the sound and the visual is good, if everyone could stop their video and also mute. So in the lower left-hand corner, just click on stop video.
Moving the little green box into place.
Eyes on the wall and go into the boardroom of lettuce, flavor saver tomato, Roundup Ready soybeans. We could go on and on. This is my point, folks. There are lots of vegetables out there. There are lots of fruits out there. There are lots of chemicals. We haven't even done all those acronym chemicals. And so much of the time we end up doing these one at a time. Now, we can look over at the corporations and say, are the corporations worried about this? Well, let's become flies on the wall and go into the boardroom of a corporation where they're having a conversation where a member of the board of directors says, what are those activists up to? What are the environmentalists doing these days anyway? And suppose there's a response from another member of the staff. That member of the staff would probably say, well, they read our reports. They're speaking our language. They found some experts and they managed to hire themselves a lawyer. They're putting out lots of press releases. Some of them got degrees. They're acting respectful. And right about now, they're all over in the DNR or the Department of Environmental whatever, in hearings room 301, where they've all got 90 seconds to tell us why they don't like us. And by the way, they're all dressed up. My point being, not to minimize any of these issues or any of our victories, but we're not getting far enough, fast enough to make the amount of difference that we need to make. Just a quick view of what remedies we usually use against corporations. Well, we can fine them. And what do they do if they get a reasonably substantial fine? Well, they either raise prices, lower wages, lower benefits, demand more government subsidies, or threaten to move somewhere else. Okay? What if we cause them enough trouble that they have to launch a really expensive or seek more government subsidies or move somewhere else? And what if we really, really catch them with a huge fine and huge damage awards? And you could probably rattle off a number of companies this has happened to in the last 5 or 10 years. What do they do then? They go bankrupt. Okay, so this is a really convenient no-lose situation for them. So I think we need to ask, why aren't we getting further faster? I think a large part of the answer is that while we are doing things one at a time, and we're essentially pleading with boards or pleading with regulatory agencies to please follow the law or enforce it, corporations have been going around doing something very different. They've been changing the ground rules. They've been doing what I call downsizing democracy, and they've been making of it what I think is now little more than a theme park, where we can go through the motions, but nothing is connected to anything. Now, I think it's useful at this point to go extremely quickly to the founding parents of this nation. And without excusing any of their major oversights, I think they understood one thing very well, and that is that they were being oppressed by a very well-working combination of the monarchy and the corporations. And they no more wanted a king or a socially responsible king than they wanted corporations. So when they set up the new government in this nation, they didn't have kings and they didn't have corporations. They didn't plan on, again, allowing themselves to be subservient to corporations like the colonies themselves, or the British East India Company, or the Hudson Bay Company, or others. And they left to the states the role of chartering corporations. So since I'm from Wisconsin and I know more about that state than others, and since that's not atypical, I want to give you the example of 10 provisions that Wisconsin used to have in place that reflect how a sovereign people deals with its corporations, that it has created, remember, for a public need and a public purpose. And I call them the Wisconsin Big 10. And I want you to think how they reflect a different understanding, a different attitude, almost a different culture about what sovereign people are and what corporations are. Number one, corporations had a specific purpose. You're here to do this. It was often something like build and operate a railroad between two points or build a mill dam, something like that. Corporations were expected to fulfill but not exceed that purpose. Number two, if they did exceed that purpose, or if they did not fulfill it adequately, the state legislature revoked their charter. And this happened dozens and dozens of times and was a very common occurrence. They just revoked the charter. Third characteristic, these corporations had a limited lifespan, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. They were not set up in perpetuity, as is now the practice. Fourth characteristic, a corporation was prohibited from owning stock in other corporations. Now that's very convenient. You know who did something, they put their name on it. They couldn't say, well, but we're half owned by them and a half subsidiary and half sister over this one, and these three people own another certain percent. This is the corporation, this is its stock, this is its name, and it's responsible and liable for various actions done in that name. Fifth characteristic was that other holdings of the corporation were prohibited. In other words, real estate holdings beyond the specific need of the corporation, see number one, purpose, were prohibited, as were various kinds of other speculations, stock speculations, and so on. Sixth characteristic, what we tend to identify today with stockholders, the fact that their liability is limited, was not necessarily the case. In many cases, stockholders were liable for anything the corporation did while they owned the stock, not just to the amount of their stock, but to however much else was owed. And this was true even if they later sold their stock. They were still responsible and liable for what happened while they had held it. Six, the legislature didn't hesitate to set rates and conditions under which corporations operated. Seven, corporations were prohibited unless their purpose was charitable or civic or educational. They were prohibited from giving to charity and other sort of civic pursuits. Why? For two reasons. Number one, it was regarded as a waste of stockholder resources. And number two, it was regarded as a way of preventing them from extending their influence in undue ways. Now, these last two are probably my favorites, 9 and 10. Number 9, all political contributions by corporations were prohibited. The language on this in Wisconsin is really inspiring, and it goes on to describe not just financial contributions to candidates, but all political activity of any kind. Corporations were to be kept out of the political process. And number 10, they had a really ambitious open records law, such that a committee of the legislature, which is what set up a corporation to begin with, a committee of the legislature could inspect any vaults, documents, records, papers, and on of that corporation in order to determine what it was doing. And they also could examine under oath any officer, director, or employee or stockholder of the corporation, because they understood that if the state set up the corporation to serve a public interest and the public need, that they would need to know what on earth that corporation was doing. And the only way to do this is to see the records, all the records, not a special report that they write up just because you want to hear about their minority hiring or their effort to eliminate some chemical. Anyway, those 10 provisions, I think, really reflect what a sovereign people does, or the kind of thing a sovereign people does when it believes it is in charge and corporations are to serve the people. Of course, the corporations had a response to this, and I'm just going to give you a quick sense of it. But every time the people succeeded in doing something, or some part of democracy worked for the people, The corporations didn't go in there with even more lawyers, more experts and so on. They changed the rules of the game so it wouldn't work next time. Some examples of that. There were many legal doctrines that were used for people to get legitimate damages from corporations. Doctrines like the doctrine of harms, of nuisance, of property, and of course, bankruptcy in another sense. All those doctrines were changed bit by bit in the courts by corporation lawyers to the point where they're basically now a support system for corporations. Another thing the corporations did was the states were really hard on them. Local governments, legislatures, and state courts really held corporations to many of the laws and provisions that I outlined. So corporations did anything they could to get out of there. They made an effort to get from state courts into federal courts, which we can talk about much later if anyone wants to. They made quite an effort to get out of the legislatures themselves and into something more protected. And the two things that were much more protected turned out to be regulatory agencies and courts. Corporations also, when a state passed a law that they didn't like, corporations also went to the Supreme Court and they said they can't do that because that interferes with interstate commerce. And by the late 19th century, they were able to carry this argument so that dozens and dozens of state laws were invalidated by the US Supreme Court because they were a restraint of trade.
Okay, now Tom will now speak about the defining law of corporations and ways to rewrite these unjust practices.
What is the defining law of corporations? Well, it's the law that gives the corporations a structure, a form, and in effect, it's a script. And the corporate lawyers write this script for the corporations, and it includes the state corporate codes and court cases that form the notion that corporations have powers and they have rights. The regulatory law is really about corporations. It's by and for the corporations. We think that regulatory law is to protect communities and nature, but in fact, its basic premise is the assumption that corporations have the rights of constitutional persons, and that corporations have constitutional rights to due process and equal protection. So in effect, the corporations have these advantages over us, and what we get is the democracy theme park, where we can pull the levers on voting machines and talk into microphones at hearings. But don't worry, they're not connected to anything and nobody's listening except us. And that's a direct quote from Jane Ann Morris. What regulatory law regulates is citizen input and not corporate behavior. So here I have a question for you. Have you presented testimony at regulatory hearings to defend your community from corporate harm? And what you could do is you could go to the chat, just raise your hand or however you want to think about this. But yeah, I see Susie has a thumbs up, and I know she's done that many times. And so have we here in Colorado, where I live. And I want to give you a little example of my early adventures into doing public testimonies at these hearings. So, and this may ring true to you too. I prepare as if the fate of the universe is in my hands. The hearing room is overflowing with opposition to the harmful corporate project. The testimonies are true from the heart and well-researched. I and other presenters think our overwhelming opposition, our moral and rational objections, would influence the officials to stop the project. the next day we read in the paper that the officials have approved the project. And then it becomes clear to us that the officials had already planned to approve the project all along. And that the purpose of the hearing was for us who oppose the project to blow off steam and to think we had a voice in the matter, or at best become discouraged and quit our complaining. So that's my experience with regulatory law and the public hearing part of that. There is no binding, there's no legally binding purpose in giving testimony. And so what we did in our work here in Boulder County, Colorado, was to convert the testimony over into eventually it became a riot and scared the commissioners out of the room and shut down the writing of the regulations for fracking of that community. So regulatory law was created and is advanced with the cooperation and sometimes the urgings of big corporations to protect their ability to exploit and to externalize their harms to people and to the environments. A corporation is an artificial creation that's set up by a state by the state corporation codes. And these state laws, plus a bunch of court cases, form the basis for the notion that corporations have powers and rights. So when we talk about the court cases, what we're talking about is judicial precedent, fiat lawmaking, where the courts get to make the laws based on decisions that are made. Could be a decision in some little community in some other part of the country. But if a judge decides that this is so, then that becomes universal for everyone else. And that's one of the principles of corporate organizing, is that any of their victories is a victory for all corporations. So defining law is invisible to us because we've been colonized and have accepted it as a given. We leave this defining law in corporation codes, bankruptcy law, insurance law, etc., to corporation lawyers who rewrite it every few years without so much as a whimper from citizen activists. Then we wonder why the parts per billion regulations aren't enforced. So if the civil rights movement had been afraid to touch the deep defining law of the land, we'd still be laboring under separate but equal, for as long as we stick with regulatory law and leave defining law to corporate lawyers, we'll have corporate government. So what is our solution? What do we do? We could keep doing what hasn't worked in case it works next time. We could denounce people who suggest that what we're doing isn't working. We could declare victory so our folks won't get so depressed and discouraged. And what Jane Ann Morris says that she'd like to steer clear of these options. And she says she'd also like to avoid negotiating with corporations as though they were persons with a role in a democratic system, and avoid doing anything else that accepts that corporations have the constitutional rights of human persons. So what she's really talking about here is rewriting the defining law of corporations. And so these are some points that she's already made, and I'll just review them. Prohibit corporations from owning stock in other corporations. That would end corporate control of huge markets with shifting of responsibility, liability, resources, assets, and taxes back and forth among parent organizations or corporations. Prohibit corporations from choosing when to go out of business. That would end evasions from taxation, repayment of government loans, paying creditors and pensions, paying for health care, and paying for toxic cleanups. Make stockholders liable for corporate debts. Stockholders would then reallocate their resources to local sustainable businesses and healthy local economies, and away from corporations engaged in risky, toxic projects. And she says these three features were once common features of state corporation codes. Prohibit corporate participation in the democratic process, no paying for political ads, making campaign contributions, etc. Prohibit corporations from having constitutional rights. A corporation is an artificial creation set up to serve a public need, not an independent entity with intrinsic rights. Prohibit corporations from making any civic, charitable, or educational donations. Such donations are used to warp the entire social and economic fabric of society and make people afraid to speak out against corporations. These were all once law too. And then some other things: make the public airways public again, end corporate propaganda through the leasing of public airways to huge corporations by a puppet federal agency. Now, Jane Ann concludes, what if a regulatory agency gave a hearing and nobody came? The outcome would be the same, but we wouldn't have wasted all our time and resources, nor would we have helped grant an aura of legitimacy to a sham proceeding. What we could do instead, we could get together with the lawyer and the expert and begin to figure out how to stop being collaborators. So Jane Ann was very much a founder of the community rights movement, and she was into making systemic change. And she was an environmentalist, so didn't speak in this talk anyway about social justice issues. But what I would like to say about this is that why and how did the corporations become so powerful? And I think that it's basically the form itself. It's a vehicle for the wealthy to exploit and extract and pull money up to themselves and accumulate power. And so I could see that how the corporations began as reputable entities that would do things like build the Brooklyn Bridge, and when it was finished, the corporation was over and the accomplishment would be appreciated and used by everyone. But I think that there was such great amounts of money exchanging hands and concentrated into the hands of the corporate boards, they became powerful enough so that they could pay off the politicians to get the laws they wanted to make themselves perpetual and to give themselves rights that legal rights that exceeded those of humans. So I think that the corporate form itself is problematic and something that we should all discuss. I think really what it comes down to are the fundamental structures of capitalism that have to be addressed. And if we are going to be consistent with our community rights heritage, we're going to want to organize in ways that will produce and broadcast what we want rather than what we think we can get. So I want to turn this part of the talk over to Heidi, who will prepare us for our group discussion. And thank you very much for listening.
Hi, I don't have a lot to say because we'd like to hear from you now. Since there are a few of us here, if you might feel more comfortable raising your hand, you can, in your navigation bar at the bottom where it says reactions, you can click on that and raise your hand, or you can just physically do it and we'll try to call on you. So I see a few comments in the chat. Antonio says capitalism for the rich, and Tom was starting to get into that. So who'd like to, who's itching to say something? Greg, please do. Well,
Well,
Paul.
thank you. Yeah, wonderful presentations by both of you. Just a very, very quick story about the changing of the corporate code. Many years ago, I got wind of the American Bar Association, their corporate committee, which every generation would sort of make the rounds. And in the name of updating the state corporate codes of every state, they would make the rounds, and sort of like the guy who goes down the street selling the encyclopedias, you know, that, hey, the neighbor bought one, so you got to get one. And so the corporate entities, corporate attorneys would they came to Ohio, and they said, we need to quote unquote update, which was euphemism for, you know, ditching, corporatizing, privatizing. And they would say, well, you don't want to, you know, lose ground to Indiana or Illinois, do you? Because we were just there. And, you know, they had not seen me before, and they just assumed, you know, what law firm are you from? And you know, you must be an advocate, because no other, you know, advocate working for justice or peace was aware of this. So it's extremely important that we, you know, pay attention to what Tom and others were saying. And by the way, you know, when they asked me, and I said, well, I just think that corporations shouldn't have constitutional rights, they just said, oh, pass.
Greg, would you mind introducing yourself for folks who might not know your background?
Greg Coleridge, live in Ohio. For many years, I worked for the American Friends Service Committee, and was connected to POCLAD, the program on corporations, law, and democracy, of which Jane Ann was a fellow principal. And just tremendous person, very sad that she passed very, very prematurely. I now moved to amend the national organization trying to pass the We the People Amendment that would abolish all corporate constitutional rights, as well as the equally bizarre constitutional doctrine of political money being treated as First Amendment protected free speech.
Thank you. Hanuman, would you like to speak?
Yeah, hi. I apologize for getting in a little late. I think it was a fabulous presentation, and I was thinking, as we were saying, you know, don't go to the regulatory party. Just let's let them throw their party by themselves. But when we were fighting the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, we knew all along that what we were doing was only for the legal record, so that the lawyers could come in and say, look, this was presented and that was presented, and, you know, the facts, and they won. So I'd just love to hear some feedback about that.
Anyone want to take that on?
I think we've all experienced, you know, thinking that we had a leg up, and that we really, you know, had a cause that was, you know, going to be taken seriously, and you know, justice and all that, and you know, it's built into this fixed system that, for the most part, we're going to lose, and I don't even like to use the win and lose, because you know, people have experienced wins, you know, but is it a systemic change, or is it just sort of a little bump in the road, and you know, you got a few carrots there. I always think of the Michigan Nestle's bottling action where over 85,000 people put in opposing comments against them increasing their removal of water from an aquifer up in northern Michigan. And still, of course, it went through because it's just built into the system. You know, the government corporate collusion. That's my input.
Yeah, thank you.
Bill?
When I said they won, I meant our lawyers won. We won. We stopped it. But we did have to jump through a whole lot of hoops and run around that wheel a lot. So that was why I wanted your feedback. We didn't have illusions of what we were doing.
I think that's valuable. And here in Colorado, you know, we began to expose the illegitimacy of the hearing process itself while, you know, talking about the harms of the project and opposition to it. But at a certain point, you know, you're just beating a dead horse because the people you're talking to are not listening usually. I mean, I've been to hearings a lot, and a lot of times the people are just like zoned out and they're on their iPads, you know, checking their Facebook and whatever they're doing. They don't care about you. And in a lot of issues, they've already made their minds up, but they're not going to listen to you. And so, you know, what we would do is then point this out and point out the illegitimacy of the hearings and how these are not legally binding, that, you know, these testimonies are usually just totally ignored and forgotten. And, you know, but at the same time, there is what you're saying, there is a legal value to going on the record in opposition. And what I would say is that the lawyers may or may not have gotten very much support from the testimonies. There may have been some other things that went on that gave the lawyers the power to overturn this. It's hard to say, but the pattern is over and over and over and over and over again is that we start out with, you know, going to hearings and lobbying our officials and praying and begging and hiring a lawyer and an expert and, you know, raising money. Eventually we might get frustrated and start into direct action. Then we have to bail our friends out of jail and pay for their legal defense. And it just goes on and on and on, you know, and the point here is that if we understand the origin of this problem, the causes are in the defining laws of the corporations that allow them to act this way with impunity. And if we go about the process of understanding that and working at defeating that rather than just complaining about the individual corporate harm, that we will have a unified approach so that we can approach all issues like environmental or social justice issues, because they all come from the same place. So that instead of being all siloed into our individual issue, you know, like here in Boulder County, we tried to join together the forces that opposed fracking with the people that didn't want the extermination of prairie dogs, with the people who didn't want to have gravel mining in the St. Vrain River Valley. And we were trying to get the people who were opposing the expansion of the water theft from the Colorado River to feed the reservoirs here in the Front Range. You know, so we were working on building a coalition of people that are all based on our, you know, in our inalienable rights to a clean and peaceful environment, and, you know, the peaceful enjoyment of nature and the rights of nature, and, you know, freedom from these corporate chemicals and so on. So, you know, if we recognize that the common ground is the basic human and natural rights that we have and that nature has, and work on that basis and go after the structural changes that we need, then we've really done something substantial. But yes, I mean, your victory is really great and should be celebrated. You know,
Looks like Nancy's hand is up.
Yeah, and I would definitely say, Kinda, that I'm surprised you're the first person I've ever talked to that was successful. And I hope that success is still standing. But I will tell you that I found, or the group I belong to here in, we found important about attending hearings was to talk to people as they were going into the hearing ahead of time and after they were leaving, and handing out flyers and brochures about the work that we're doing, and to hold a meeting a day or two after the hearing to bring people in who were at the hearing and have a discussion about why they might want to view a different path towards achieving what they want. So I do think that attending hearings can be valuable. As Tom was saying, it gives us an opportunity to hook up with people.
Thanks, Nancy. Bill?
Yeah, just a couple points that I want to raise. One is a lot of times with some of these hearings, the person who's in charge is a corporate lobbyist formerly or comes from industry. So there's another way that corporations rig the game is they get into these positions. They're appointed, like the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, the corporate lobbyist, and then he's now resigned because he's been found part of the scandal of taking a huge payment and all. But and all these hearings you see, like we know, might be 150 testimonies against something and 2 or 4 for, but it still goes through. So it shouldn't be, I guess, too much of a surprise. But one other thing that corporations do besides rewrite the laws for themselves, they rewrite the laws that restrict us too. Like I just take Ohio's example. Not only, I'm sure, I don't have proof of it, but I'm sure because of the community rights bills that's why they put in a provision in the legislature that gave boards of elections the ability to unconstitutionally keep our duly qualified initiatives from the ballot if they felt they were beyond municipal authority, but that's a judicial question. And another thing they did, just look at the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. As you know, when I made some public records requests and discovered it was the Chamber of Commerce that got the one representative to insert into the budget bill to preempt, prohibit anybody bringing a lawsuit in Ohio on behalf of nature or ecosystems in any court of common pleas court in Ohio. So there again, they said, oh, they're making some success, so we'll just do our little influence and get them to rewrite the laws again.
I think for me that the takeaway from all this is that we need to expand our territory of influence beyond the community bills of rights. That's a really important part of it. That's the legal aspect of it, organizing strategy. And what that allows us to do is to formulate the kinds of laws that we are planning for our community's future. And then there have to be other things going on at the same time. Like one of the things that I regretted in the Lafayette, Colorado incident, and I'll just quickly review what happened there. We got our community bill of rights approved by, like 64% of the voters, something like that. And so we won the election. We got the signatures, we got it on the ballot, we got it elected. And then the city council and the oil and gas industries conspired to stop East Boulder County United from intervening in the defense of the Community Bill of Rights, which CELDEF told us was a very unusual thing, because usually a judge would allow the people responsible for, you know, the initiative to defend the initiative. And so what ended up happening was we didn't get to defend it on the basis of rights. We had a whole beautiful defense organized by CELDEF, and there's a legal brief that's been published on that defense. And it was going to be a rights-based defense. And so we lost the court case was lost. The city lost the court case, you know. And then, so that means that the corporate judge that presided over it had succeeded in preempting our community bill of rights. And so our response was to attempt to amend the state constitution to legalize the right to local community self-government. And we had 2 failed attempts at doing that. And so, you know, we weren't big enough to do anything other than these legal strategies. You know, there has to be a much bigger campaign than that, and including a lot of other actions. And we could talk about the kind of other actions that we think would be compatible with a community bill of rights approach, with a, you know, creating an ideal society kind of approach. And, you know, we had a very viable organization, and then of course we had medical martial law enacted on us. And so we couldn't assemble, and we couldn't, you know, meet unless we were 6 feet apart from each other and wear masks and so on. And people just didn't want to go anywhere and were afraid. And so the big question is, you know, our inalienable right to assemble has been violated because of this, and whether we feel that that's good or bad is important, I think. But also, I just think the fact is that, you know, with just an administrative act of the government, we were that right was taken away. And so the question is, what's next, and what are we going to do next? And for National Community Rights Network, we've recognized the need to educate the public. And that's why we've launched this webinar, is to provide an educational opportunity. And we would like to invite everyone to visit Jane Ann Morris's website. And the name of that website is democracythemepark.org. And her writings are there, and many video recordings and things like that of the work that she did. And these are very valuable, very inspiring documents. And so, you know, I think that you know, a good educational arm of our organizing is an important role that we could play. Does anyone else have any ideas of things that would be very compatible with the idea of making structural changes for saving the environment and our communities from corporate harm?
Tom, I want to thank you for that. Oh yeah, Susie just put Democracy Theme Park in the chat. Also on the National Community Rights Network website, there's a post about this article, and also we have a number of resources there. And one of them is The Red Deal, written by a number of young natives, subtitled Decolonization or Extinction. They know this all too well, and they're very serious about this. I think we all know that we're headed in that direction if we don't look to the source of the the road to extinction. We are coming to a close. I know Tom did ask a question there, but just before, just to make sure that we get this in, Tom, did you want to just say a little bit about what our next webinar is going to be on July 28th?
Yes, I've been communicating with Wania Locke, who is was a primary organizer at Standing Rock. And we had her come here for an event a couple of years ago. And she's a fantastic person. She's a Lakota language teacher and has a very strong experience of what it's like to be colonized. And also a man who was a runner during that whole conflict. He was one of a group of young men who ran across the country carrying the message of what was happening and at Standing Rock across the country to different places. And his name is Montgomery Brown. And so we're planning on having them come in on July 28th. If I'm right about that, if I'm not, please chime in. Yeah, and same time, same place. And we'll send out a notice on that and hope that we'll have you and maybe some of your friends and family attend. You know, I'm really looking forward to that conversation. I think that we don't even know that we're colonized for the most part, but they really know. And, you know, they were colonized, obviously, and had all this regard for the great white, you know, whatever great fearless white leader in Washington, and very polite in their conferences and stuff with them, and you know, kept harping on the fact that they had these treaties that had been agreed upon that were violated, and that they would like their treaties honored, and didn't realize that these people were ruthless criminals that just wanted to steal their land and kill them. So you know, it'll be a very interesting evening. So if you have a chance, please attend. We'd really enjoy your participation.
And let's see, I also just wanted to point out, Greg put a few notes in the chat, more about Jane Ann. She is an amazing resource. You know, she was an anthropologist of corporations. And let's see, that looks really interesting. A historical piece by Jane Ann about how corpses trumped local and state laws using the Commerce Clause. And so she's written a number of books and numerous articles, and there's also a number of videos on that, that site. So great resources available to all of us. So I think it's probably time to wrap it up. So we want to thank you for joining us, and we hope you will continue exploring this topic. It's very rich. And again, there's resources on our website, and the link to the article with the resources relating to this is in the chat. And also, if you're a community organizer and would like to know more about the Community Bill of Rights, just get in touch with us. So thank you all. Any closing remarks by anyone?
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Excellent.
Right.
Thanks a lot. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.